My name is Sarah Mitchell, and 3 months after burying my mother, I discovered she had been planning to kill people. The list was hidden behind a loose floorboard in our attic, written in her careful handwriting on yellow legal paper. 7 names, all with addresses, and next to each one, a single word that made my blood freeze. But it wasn't until I saw my father's name at the very top, with the word first written in red ink, that I understood my entire life had been a lie. I was holding that paper when I heard his truck pull into the driveway 3 hours early from work, and for the first time in my 28 years, I was genuinely afraid of the man who taught me to ride a bike. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The cancer took Linda Mitchell on a Tuesday in March, and by Friday, I was back in Riverside, Ohio, standing in the kitchen where she used to make pancakes every Sunday morning. The house felt enormous and suffocating at the same time, like being trapped inside a snow globe that someone had shaken too hard. My younger brother Tommy had driven up from Cincinnati with his girlfriend, but they lasted exactly 2 days before retreating back to their apartment, mumbling something about work commitments and promising to help with estate stuff later. That left me alone with Dad, navigating the strange choreography of grief in a house that suddenly felt too big for two people. David Mitchell had always been a man of few words, but Mom's death seemed to have stolen even those from him. He moved through the rooms like a ghost, eating the casseroles neighbors brought over without tasting them, nodding politely when people stopped by to offer condolences. The construction company he co-owned with Robert Hayes basically ran itself those first few weeks, which was probably for the best since Dad spent most of his time sitting in his recliner, staring at a television that wasn't turned on. I had taken a leave of absence from my job at a marketing firm in Columbus, telling my boss I needed time to settle Mom's affairs and make sure Dad was okay. The truth was simpler and more complicated. I couldn't stand the thought of returning to my small apartment and my routine coffee shop and my ordinary problems when the woman who gave me life was now nothing but ashes in an urn on the mantel. Grief, I learned, has its own geography, and I needed to navigate it in the place where it made the most sense. The house on Oak Street had been my parents' home for 32 years, bought when Dad's construction business was just getting started and Mom was pregnant with me. It was a classic 2-story colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch, the kind of house that appeared in movies about perfect American families. Mom had spent 3 decades making it exactly that, decorating each room with the careful attention of someone who understood that homes weren't just places to live, but places to build memories. Now walking through those rooms felt like touring a museum of my own childhood. Family photos lined the hallway staircase, marking time in increments of school pictures and holiday gatherings. There was me at 7, missing my front teeth and grinning beside a snowman Tommy and I had built. There was our family vacation to Myrtle Beach when I was 15, all of us sunburned and happy on the boardwalk. There was Tommy's high school graduation, Dad's arm around Mom's shoulders as they beamed with pride. But museums are meant to be preserved, not lived in, and after 2 weeks of tiptoeing around each other's sadness, I decided it was time to start the practical work of sorting through 30 years of accumulated life. Dad had mentioned wanting to clean out the attic, but every time I brought it up he found something else that needed his immediate attention. The garage needed organizing, the gutters needed cleaning, the fence needed repairing. Anything that kept him from confronting the boxes of Christmas decorations and old photo albums that held too many memories of the woman he'd loved since he was 23 years old. So on a Thursday morning in late March, while Dad was at a job site supervising the foundation pour for a new subdivision, I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic by myself. The air up there was thick and dusty, filled with the particular smell of old cardboard and stored memories. Sunlight filtered through a small window, illuminating particles dancing in the air like tiny ghosts. The attic was organized in the way only my mother could have managed it. Boxes were clearly labeled in her neat handwriting. Christmas decorations, photo albums 1985 to 1995. Sarah's school papers. Tommy's sports equipment. Baby clothes and toys saved for grandchildren she would never meet. I started with the Christmas boxes, figuring those would be the easiest to sort through, but even that proved harder than expected. Each ornament told a story. The ceramic angel Tommy made in second-grade art class. The baby's first Christmas ornament from my first year. The handmade stockings Mom had embroidered with our names in red and green thread. I worked steadily for 3 hours, creating piles for keep, donate, and storage. The baby clothes definitely went in storage, along with the photo albums and anything that held sentimental value. The old textbooks and outgrown sports equipment could be donated. But it was slow going, partly because everything seemed to carry emotional weight, and partly because I kept getting distracted by memories. That's when I noticed the floorboard. I was reaching for a box of Tommy's old baseball cards when my knee pressed against a section of the attic floor that felt different from the rest. Softer somehow, like it was giving slightly under pressure. I looked down and saw that one of the floorboards didn't quite line up with the others, sitting just a fraction of an inch higher than it should have been. Curiosity won over caution. I pressed harder, and the board shifted, revealing a small gap underneath. Using a screwdriver I found in Dad's toolbox downstairs, I carefully pried the board up, expecting to find old pipes or maybe some forgotten childhood treasure Tommy or I had hidden decades ago. Instead, I found a manila envelope, thick with papers and sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. My hands were shaking as I opened it, though I couldn't have said why. Maybe it was the deliberate way it had been hidden, or maybe it was the instinct that some secrets are buried for good reasons. The first thing I pulled out was a stack of newspaper clippings, all from the Riverside Gazette, dating back over the past 5 years. The headlines were the kind of small-town tragedies that make people lock their doors at night. Local businessman dies in hunting accident. Woman killed in hit and run on Highway 23. House fire claims family of 3. Construction worker falls from scaffolding. At first I thought maybe Mom had been keeping track of local news, the way some people collect obituaries or follow crime stories. But as I looked closer, I noticed that someone had used a yellow highlighter to mark specific details in each article. Names, addresses, the circumstances of each death. And in the margins, written in Mom's careful handwriting, were notes that made my stomach drop. David was there. Robert knew about the permits. Insurance paid out fast.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The second thing in the envelope was worse. A yellow legal pad, the kind Mom used for grocery lists and household planning, but instead of milk and bread, she had written names. 7 of them, each followed by an address and what appeared to be research notes. Details about daily routines, where people worked, what time they came home. The kind of information you'd need if you were planning something terrible. But it was the third item that made me understand I was holding something that could destroy everything I thought I knew about my family. A life insurance policy in my father's name, dated just 6 months ago, with a beneficiary amount that was 10 times larger than anything a small-town construction worker should have been able to afford. The premium payments were being made from an account I'd never heard of, and the signature at the bottom was definitely my mother's. I sat on the attic floor, surrounded by boxes of Christmas ornaments and childhood memories, holding evidence that my mother had been planning something that made no sense with the woman who used to volunteer at the church food bank and never missed sending birthday cards to distant relatives. The woman who cried during sad commercials and refused to kill spiders, choosing instead to capture them in glasses and release them outside. That's when I heard Dad's truck in the driveway. I had maybe 3 minutes before he'd come looking for me, wondering what I'd been doing up there all day. 3 minutes to decide whether to confront him with what I'd found, or to hide it and pretend I'd never seen evidence that my parents' marriage might have been built on something much darker than I'd ever imagined. The smart thing would have been to put everything back, replace the floorboard, and think about what I'd discovered. To process it slowly and rationally, maybe even talk to Tommy about it first. But as I heard Dad's heavy footsteps on the front porch, all I could think about was the red ink next to his name on that list, and the word that made my hands shake as I read it again. First, I shoved the papers back into the envelope, and climbed down from the attic as quietly as I could, my heart hammering against my ribs. By the time Dad called out, "Sarah, you up there?" I was in the hallway bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, and trying to figure out why the woman who raised me to always tell the truth had been keeping secrets that could send someone to prison. "Just cleaning," I called back, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. "Found some of Tommy's old stuff you might want to look at." "I'll be up in a minute," he replied, but I could hear him moving around in the kitchen, probably looking for something to eat that didn't require actual cooking. Since Mom died, his diet had consisted mainly of sandwiches and whatever the neighbors brought over. I had maybe 10 minutes before he'd actually make it upstairs, which gave me just enough time to think about what I was going to do with the information that was currently burning a hole in the envelope clutched against my chest. Part of me wanted to march downstairs and demand an explanation. The daughter who had spent 28 years trusting her parents completely wanted to believe there was some reasonable explanation for why my mother had been collecting information about local deaths and researching life insurance policies. But a larger part of me, the part that had been watching Dad's behavior since Mom's funeral, was starting to remember things that hadn't seemed important at the time. Like how he'd insisted on handling all the funeral arrangements himself, keeping Tommy and me away from the details. Like how he'd been strangely calm about everything, more resigned than devastated. Like how he'd refused to let us see Mom in the hospital during her final days, claiming the chemotherapy had changed her too much and she wouldn't want us to remember her that way. What if the cancer hadn't killed her at all? The thought hit me like a physical blow, so shocking and terrible that I actually gasped out loud. But once it was there, I couldn't make it go away. What if everything I thought I knew about my mother's death was wrong? What if the papers I'd found weren't evidence of future plans, but documentation of something that had already happened? I could hear Dad moving around downstairs, opening and closing cabinet doors, probably looking for the coffee Mom used to make fresh every morning. Such a normal domestic sound, but now it felt ominous, like the footsteps of someone I didn't really know moving through a house that might have been the scene of a crime. That's when I made a decision that probably saved my life, though I wouldn't understand that until much later. Instead of going downstairs to confront my father with questions that might not have answers I wanted to hear, I grabbed my purse and car keys and walked out the back door as quietly as I could. I told myself I was just going for a drive to clear my head, maybe stop by Murphy's Cafe for coffee and try to process what I'd discovered in a place that felt safe and public. But as I pulled out of the driveway, I realized I was shaking too hard to drive safely, and the envelope on the passenger seat seemed to be radiating heat like it was radioactive. 2 blocks from the house, I pulled over and called the one person I thought might be able to help me make sense of what I'd found. Detective Maria Santos had been Mom's friend since high school, one of the few people from their graduating class who had stayed in Riverside. She'd worked her way up from patrol officer to detective over the past 15 years, and more importantly, she was someone I trusted to tell me the truth, even if it wasn't what I wanted to hear. "Sarah, honey," she said when she answered on the second ring. "How are you holding up? I've been meaning to stop by and check on you and your dad. Maria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." My voice was steadier than I'd expected, which gave me the courage to continue. "Were there any questions about how Mom died? Anything that seemed unusual about her case?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that I started to wonder if the call had dropped. When Maria finally spoke, her voice had shifted from friendly concern to something more professional and careful. "Sarah, why are you asking me that? Did something happen? I found some papers in the attic, things that don't make sense. Maria, I think Mom might have been planning something before she died, and I think it might have involved Dad." Another pause, even longer this time. When Maria spoke again, I could hear the sound of a door closing, like she was moving somewhere more private. "Where are you right now?" "In my car about 2 blocks from the house." "Maria, you're scaring me. What's going on?" "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't go back to that house. Not yet. Can you meet me at my office in 20 minutes? And bring whatever you found with you." The line went dead, leaving me sitting in my car with the terrible understanding that my worst fears were probably about to be confirmed. Detective Maria Santos, who had known my family for decades, who had eaten dinner at our table and attended every one of my birthday parties growing up, was telling me not to go home. Which meant that home might not be safe anymore. I started the car and drove toward the police station, the envelope beside me feeling heavier with each mile. Behind me, in the house where I'd grown up believing in the fundamental goodness of the people who raised me, my father was probably wondering where I'd gone, and why I'd left so suddenly. What he didn't know was that I'd found the evidence that would unravel 30 years of lies, and that by the time the sun set on Riverside, Ohio, one of us would be running for our lives. The truth, as it turned out, was so much worse than anything I could have imagined. Detective Maria Santos was waiting for me in the parking lot of the Riverside police station when I arrived, her expression grim in a way that made my stomach drop even further. She wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a sweater, but there was something about her posture that screamed cop. The way she scanned the parking lot before approaching my car, the way her hand rested casually near her hip, where I knew she kept her service weapon, even when off duty. "Let me see what you found," she said without preamble as I rolled down my window. No small talk, no gentle transition into whatever conversation we were about to have. Just the direct approach of someone who already suspected what I'd discovered was as bad as I feared. I handed her the envelope through the window, watching her face as she flipped through the contents. Her expression didn't change much, but I saw her jaw tighten when she reached the newspaper clippings, and something that might have been resignation when she got to the list of names. "How long have you known?" I asked when she finally looked up at me. "Known what exactly?" But the way she said it told me she was buying time, not asking for clarification. "Known that my mother was planning to kill people. Known that my father's name is at the top of her hit list. Known that the woman who raised me was apparently some kind of serial killer in training." My voice cracked on the last words, and I realized I was crying without having felt the tears start. Maria looked around the parking lot again, then opened my passenger door and slid into the seat beside me. "Sarah, your mother wasn't planning to kill anyone. She was trying to prove that someone else had already killed 7 people in this town, and that your father was going to be the 8th victim." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had been so focused on the terrifying possibility that my mother was a potential murderer that I hadn't considered the alternative. That she might have been trying to prevent murders, not commit them. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. Maria sighed and rubbed her temples like she was fighting a headache. "Your mom came to me about 8 months ago with a theory. She thought someone was targeting people in Riverside, making their deaths look like accidents. She'd been tracking patterns, collecting evidence, trying to build a case. But the police didn't believe her. The police couldn't do anything with what she had. No concrete evidence, no witnesses, no clear motive. Just a list of deaths that could easily be explained as tragic coincidences in a small town where people work dangerous jobs and drive on rural highways late at night." I stared at the papers scattered across my lap, seeing them in an entirely different light. The highlighted newspaper articles weren't evidence of planning, they were evidence of investigation. The notes in the margins weren't planning tools, they were questions. David was there, Robert knew about the permits. Insurance paid out fast. Not statements of fact, but suspicions that needed to be verified. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she tell anyone in the family? Because she thought the killer was someone close to your family. Someone who would know if she was getting too close to the truth. Maria's voice was gentle but firm. "Sarah, your mother believed that whoever was behind these deaths had been watching your family for months. She was afraid that if she said anything to you or Tommy, it might put you in danger. But Dad's name is on the list. His name is first. Because she thought he was the next target. The life insurance policy she took out wasn't for her benefit. It was to make sure you and Tommy would be taken care of if something happened to him." Maria paused, studying my face. "Sarah, your mother didn't die of cancer." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "What do you mean?" "I mean the cancer was real, but it wasn't what killed her. Linda was murdered, and I think she knew it was coming." I couldn't breathe. The parking lot around us seemed to blur and spin, and for a moment I thought I might actually pass out. "That's impossible. She was in the hospital. There were doctors, nurses, Tommy and I were there when she died. Were you in the room when it happened?" I tried to remember, but the final days at the hospital were a blur of grief and exhaustion. "No, Dad said she was sleeping, that it would be better if we remembered her the way she was. He stayed with her that last night, and in the morning he told us she'd passed peacefully in her sleep. And you believed him because why wouldn't you? He was your father, he was grieving, and people die in hospitals from cancer every day." Maria's voice was matter of fact, but I could hear the anger underneath. "The perfect cover. You think Dad killed her?" It wasn't a question. "I think your mother suspected he was involved in the other deaths, and I think someone silenced her before she could prove it. Whether that someone was your father or his business partner, or someone else entirely, I don't know yet." The implications were staggering. Not just that my mother had been murdered, but that I'd been living in the same house as her killer for the past 3 months. Eating meals with him, comforting him through his supposed grief, trusting him completely while he hid the truth about the woman we'd buried. What about the other names on the list? The people Mom thought were going to be killed. Maria pulled out her phone and scrolled through what looked like official police reports. 3 of them are already dead. Janet Morrison, car accident 2 weeks after your mother passed. Bill Hendricks, heart attack at home, no witnesses. Patricia Wells, house fire last month while she was out of town, but she came back early from her trip. And the others, still alive, as far as I know. But Sarah, if your mother was right about the pattern, they're all in immediate danger. And more importantly, whoever killed her knows that you might have found her research. I felt the blood drain from my face. How would they know that? Because small towns talk, and people have seen you coming and going from the house, cleaning out the attic. If someone's been watching your family, they know you're going through your mother's things. Maria's hand moved toward her weapon again. Sarah, where's your father right now? At home, I think. I left while he was there. I checked the time on my dashboard. That was about an hour ago. Have you talked to him since you left? Called him, texted him? No, I came straight here after I called you. Maria was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see her working through possibilities in her head. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I don't think you should go back to that house tonight. Maybe not for several nights. Where am I supposed to go? All my clothes are there, my laptop, everything. You can stay with me and my husband. We have a guest room, and more importantly, we have security systems and neighbors who pay attention. She paused. But first, I think we need to have a conversation with someone who might be able to fill in some of the gaps in your mother's research. Who? Carol Jensen. She was your mom's closest friend, and according to these notes, Linda was sharing her suspicions with someone. Carol's name appears in the margins of several of these newspaper clippings. Carol Jensen lived in a tidy ranch house on the other side of town, surrounded by flower gardens that my mother had always admired. She'd been part of my parents' social circle for as long as I could remember, the kind of family friend who showed up for birthday parties and graduation ceremonies without being asked. Her husband had died 5 years earlier, and since then she'd become something of a town busybody, the kind of woman who knew everyone's business, and wasn't shy about sharing it. When she answered the door and saw Maria and me standing on her porch, her face immediately crumpled into an expression of sympathy mixed with something that looked like relief. Oh, Sarah, honey, I've been hoping you'd come by. I've been so worried about you, living in that house with... She stopped abruptly, glancing at Maria. Maybe you should come inside. Carol's living room was decorated in shades of blue and white, with family photos covering every available surface. She offered us coffee, but Maria declined for both of us, pulling out a small digital recorder and setting it on the coffee table between us. Carol, we need to ask you about Linda, about some research she was doing before she died. Carol's hands fluttered nervously in her lap. I told her she was getting herself into dangerous territory. I told her to leave it alone, but Linda never could let sleeping dogs lie. What did she tell you? I asked. Everything. About the accidents that weren't accidents. About the pattern she'd discovered. About her suspicions regarding David and Robert's business dealings. Carol looked directly at me. Honey, your mother was convinced that your father and his business partner were running some kind of insurance scam, targeting people who were heavily insured, making their deaths look accidental, then collecting on policies they'd somehow arranged. But that's impossible. Dad doesn't work in insurance. He's in construction. Construction gives you access to a lot of things. Maria said quietly. Permits, building codes, safety inspections. It would be easy to sabotage a structure if you knew how it was built. Carol nodded grimly. Linda started noticing the pattern after that family died in the house fire on Maple Street. The Henderson, David's company, had done some electrical work there just 2 months before the fire. When she looked into it more, she found that Mitchell and Hayes Construction had worked on properties connected to at least 5 of the suspicious deaths. What kind of work? Electrical repairs, foundation work, roofing projects, always small jobs, the kind that wouldn't attract much attention but would give them access to houses, knowledge of structural weaknesses, opportunities to plant devices, or create hazards that might not be discovered until it was too late. I felt sick. And Mom found evidence of this. She found connections, patterns, but no smoking gun, nothing that would stand up in court. Carol wrung her hands. That's when she started talking about going to the state police, maybe even the FBI. She said the local authorities were too close to the situation, that there might be corruption involved. Did she say she suspected anyone in particular? She thought Robert Hayes was the mastermind, your father's business partner. Linda believed David was being manipulated, maybe blackmailed into participating. She couldn't accept that the man she'd been married to for 30 years could be a cold-blooded killer. But I could see from Maria's expression that she wasn't so sure about Dad's innocence. What happened when Linda got sick? Carol's voice dropped to almost a whisper. She called me the day before she went into the hospital for the last time. She said she'd found proof, something that would expose everything. She was scared, Sarah. More scared than I'd ever heard her. She said if anything happened to her, I should make sure you and Tommy got her research. But you didn't give it to us, because I was terrified. Linda died 3 days later, and David wouldn't let anyone see her at the hospital. Said she was too weak, too changed by the treatments. Then suddenly she was gone, and he was making all the funeral arrangements, and everything happened so fast. Carol wiped tears from her eyes. I should have spoken up then, but I was afraid. If Linda was right about what she'd discovered, then whoever killed her would kill anyone else who knew about it. Do you know what proof she found? Something about insurance policies. She'd somehow gotten access to records that showed a pattern of life insurance claims in the past 5 years, all connected to Mitchell and Hayes Construction in some way. Either they'd done work for the victims, or the victims had worked for them, or there were business relationships that created opportunities. Maria leaned forward. Carol, did Linda tell you where she hid this evidence? She said she put everything somewhere safe, somewhere David would never think to look. She said if anything
happened to her, the truth would still come out eventually. I thought about the loose floorboard in the attic, about how carefully my mother had hidden her research. She hid it in the house. But what I found was just her preliminary investigation. There must be more somewhere. Where? Maria asked. I closed my eyes, trying to think like my mother. Where would she hide something important? Something David would never find. He rarely went in the attic, never helped with household cleaning, avoided anything that looked like domestic organization. Her sewing room, I said suddenly. She had a sewing machine in the basement, next to Dad's office. He never went in there, said it was her space. She could have hidden something there. Maria stood up. We need to get that evidence tonight. Before David realizes what you've found and decides to destroy it. But if he's dangerous, if he really did kill Mom, isn't it too risky to go back to the house? Not if we're smart about it. Carol, can you call David and invite him over for dinner? Keep him occupied for a couple of hours. Carol nodded eagerly. I can say I made too much pot roast, that I'm worried about him not eating properly since Linda died. He won't suspect anything. As we drove back toward my childhood home, I tried to process everything I'd learned in the past few hours. My mother wasn't a potential killer. She was a victim who'd been trying to expose a killer. My father might be that killer, or he might be another victim, manipulated by his business partner into participating in something horrific. The woman I'd trusted to help me understand the truth was a police detective who'd apparently been investigating my family for months without telling me. And somewhere in the house where I'd grown up believing in safety and love, there was evidence that could either clear my father's name or send him to prison for the rest of his life. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to break into my own childhood home to search for proof that the man who'd taught me to drive and helped me with homework and walked me down the aisle at my wedding might be a serial killer. But as we pulled into the driveway and I saw that Dad's truck was gone, probably parked in Carol's driveway by now, I realized that the truth about my family was worth any risk. Even if that truth destroyed everything I'd ever believed about the people who raised me. The house felt different when we entered through the back door using my key. Not just empty, but somehow hostile, like the walls themselves were keeping secrets. Maria had insisted on going in first, her hand resting on her weapon as she cleared each room with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this before. I followed behind her, my heart hammering so loudly, I was sure it would give us away if anyone was hiding inside. Clear, she whispered after checking the main floor. But we need to move fast. Carol can only keep your father occupied for so long before he starts getting suspicious. The basement stairs creaked under our weight as we descended into what had always been Dad's domain. His workshop took up most of the space, with tools hanging from pegboards and half-finished projects scattered across multiple workbenches. But tucked into the far corner, behind a partition Dad had built years ago, was Mom's sewing area. A small space with good lighting, a vintage Singer sewing machine, and dozens of plastic storage containers filled with fabric, patterns, and notions. I'd spent countless hours down here as a child, sitting on a small stool while Mom hemmed my school clothes or worked on Halloween costumes. The smell of fabric softener and machine oil brought back memories of safety and warmth, of a mother who took time from her busy schedule to make sure her children always looked presentable. It felt wrong to be here now, searching for evidence that might destroy everything I remembered about our family. Where would she hide something she didn't want your father to find? Maria asked, scanning the organized chaos of Mom's crafting supplies. I tried to think like my mother, to channel 30 years of watching her organize and reorganize this space. She was methodical about everything, labeling boxes and keeping detailed inventories of her supplies. But she was also clever, understanding that the best hiding places were often the most obvious ones. The pattern box, I said suddenly, pointing to a large plastic container labeled Dress Patterns 1990 to 2010. She hasn't sewn a dress in 15 years, but she kept that box because she said you never knew when you might need a classic pattern. Dad always teased her about being a pack rat. Inside the container were dozens of paper patterns in their original envelopes, organized by size and style. But underneath the patterns, wrapped in an old pillowcase, was another manila envelope. This one was thicker than what I'd found in the attic, and when I opened it I understood why my mother had been so afraid. The first document was a spreadsheet printed on several pages, showing life insurance policies taken out over the past 5 years. 19 policies in total, all for amounts between $50,000 and $200,000. All the beneficiaries were listed as Mitchell and Hayes Construction Company, listed as the deceased's employer or business partner. The premium payments had been made through a complex web of shell companies, but Mom had traced them back to a single bank account controlled by Robert Hayes. Jesus, Maria breathed, looking over my shoulder. This is a systematic operation. The second document was even more damning. Bank records showing deposits into Robert Hayes' personal account corresponding exactly to insurance payouts. The amounts were staggering. Over the past 5 years, he'd collected nearly $2 million from policies on people who died in what appeared to be accidents. But it was the third document that made my blood run cold. A partially completed life insurance application in my father's name, with Robert Hayes listed as the beneficiary. The application was dated just 2 weeks before Mom had entered the hospital for her final stay. Someone had been planning Dad's death, and they'd wanted to make sure they'd profit from it. Look at this, Maria said, pulling out what appeared to be audio transcripts. Your mother was recording conversations. The transcripts were from phone calls, dated over several months before Mom's death. Robert Hayes talking to someone identified only as M about timing and methods. References to making it look natural and waiting for the right opportunity. Most chilling of all was a conversation from just 3 days before Mom went into the hospital. The Linda problem needs to be handled soon. She's asking too many questions, and David's getting nervous. We can't afford to have her talking to the wrong people. What about David? He's not going to just stand by if something happens to his wife. David won't be a problem much longer. His policy is already in place, and after Linda's gone, he'll be too grief-stricken to think clearly. A few months of mourning, then a tragic accident. Maybe a fall from some scaffolding, or a problem with his truck brakes on one of those winding mountain roads. I sank onto Mom's sewing stool, the implications hitting me like a physical blow. Not only had Robert Hayes been systematically murdering people for insurance money, but he'd been planning to kill both my parents. Mom's death hadn't been random or opportunistic. It had been calculated, necessary to silence the one person who'd gotten close to exposing his operation. There's more, Maria said grimly, pulling out what looked like medical records. Sarah, these are your mother's actual hospital charts. The ones that show what really happened during her final stay. I took the papers with shaking hands. The medical terminology was mostly beyond me, but certain phrases stood out with terrifying clarity. Unexpected deterioration, sudden cardiac event inconsistent with patient's condition. Request for autopsy denied by family. Dad refused an autopsy. According to this, he insisted that your mother had suffered enough, that she wouldn't want her body subjected to further procedures. The attending physician made a note that he disagreed with the decision, but family wishes were respected. Because an autopsy would have shown she was murdered. Almost certainly. Look at this blood work from her final day. There are elevated levels of potassium that don't match her treatment regimen. Someone injected her with something that caused heart failure. I thought about that last night at the hospital when Dad had insisted Tommy and I go home and get some rest. When he'd promised to stay with Mom and call us if anything changed. When he'd been alone with her for the 6 hours between our departure and her death. Do you think Dad did it himself, or was he just providing access for Robert? I don't know yet. But Sarah, look at the timestamp on this final medical entry. Your mother's heart stopped at 3:47 a.m. But according to the hospital's visitor log, your father signed out at 11:30 p.m. the night before. The significance hit me immediately. He wasn't there when she died. Which means someone else was. Someone who had access to the BOTCU, who knew how to administer a lethal injection without triggering immediate alarms, who could walk out of that hospital without being questioned. A doctor, or a nurse, or someone posing as medical personnel. Robert Hayes has been planning this operation for years. He'd have needed inside help at the hospital, people who could create opportunities and cover tracks. The sound of a car in the driveway made us both freeze. We weren't expecting Dad back for at least another hour, but the rumble of a truck engine was unmistakable. Maria immediately began shoving the documents back into the envelope, while I tried to process what we'd learned and what it meant for our immediate safety. Is there another way out of here? Maria whispered. The storm cellar. It connects to the basement but has an outside entrance. I pointed toward a narrow door I hadn't opened in years. But Maria, what if that's not Dad upstairs? What if Robert figured out what we're doing? The footsteps above us were heavier than Dad's usual gait, and there seemed to be more than one person moving around up there. Maria drew her weapon and motioned for me to stay behind her as we moved toward the storm cellar door. But before we could reach it, the basement lights went out, plunging us into complete darkness. Sarah Mitchell, a voice called from the top of the basement stairs. Not Robert Hayes, not my father, but someone I didn't recognize. We know you're down there. We know what you found. You need to come upstairs so we can have a conversation. Maria's hand found my arm in the darkness, her grip firm and reassuring. How many of them are there? She whispered so quietly I could barely hear her. I listened carefully to the sounds from upstairs. At least 2 people, maybe 3, moving through the house, with the confidence of people who knew the layout. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore, which suggested they weren't worried about neighbors hearing. That was particularly ominous, given that the nearest house was almost a quarter mile away. We're not going to hurt you, the voice continued. We just need to discuss how to handle this situation in a way that works for everyone. Your mother got herself involved in things she didn't understand, and we don't want the same thing to happen to you. Like hell, Maria breathed. She guided me toward the storm cellar door, moving carefully in the darkness. But as we reached it, we heard the sound of more vehicles arriving outside. Car doors slamming, multiple voices coordinating something. Whatever was happening upstairs was bigger than just a conversation. The storm cellar door was old and heavy, requiring both of us to lift it open. The night air that rushed in was cold and damp, carrying the scent of rain and earth. Maria went first, pulling herself up through the opening, and then reaching back to help me. We emerged behind the house, near Mom's old vegetable garden, with a clear view of the driveway, and the 3 vehicles now parked there. 2 were SUVs with tinted windows, the kind of anonymous vehicles that screamed government or corporate security. The 3rd was Robert Hayes' black pickup truck, confirming our worst fears about who was orchestrating this confrontation. We need to get to my car, Maria whispered. It's parked on the street, but we'll have to cross open ground to reach it. What about calling for backup? Already did. But we're at least 15 minutes away from help, and I don't think these people are planning to wait that long. As if to emphasize her point, we heard the basement door slam open and heavy footsteps on the stairs. Flashlight beams began sweeping through the basement windows, searching for any sign of where we'd gone. It wouldn't take them long to figure out we'd used the storm cellar. Sarah, Robert Hayes' voice carried across the yard from the back porch. I know you're out there. I know what your mother told you, and I know you think you understand what's been happening. But you're only seeing part of the picture. Maria started moving toward the tree line that bordered the back of the property, staying low and keeping to the shadows. I followed, clutching the envelope of evidence against my chest like a lifeline. Behind us, more flashlight beams appeared as the search expanded to the yard. Your father isn't the innocent victim your mother believed him to be. Robert continued, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of someone trying to negotiate from a position of power. David has been a willing participant in our business arrangement from the beginning. The insurance policies, the accidents, even your mother's death. He signed off on all of it. I stumbled, nearly falling as the implications of his words hit me. Not only was my father involved in the murder scheme, but he'd participated in killing my mother. The man who'd held me when I cried as a child, who'd taught me to change a tire and balance a checkbook, had helped murder the woman who'd given birth to me. That's not necessarily true, Maria whispered, steadying me. He could be lying, trying to turn you against your father. But deep down, I was starting to remember things that hadn't seemed significant at the time. Dad's unusual calmness after Mom's death. His insistence on handling all the funeral arrangements alone. The way he'd discouraged Tommy and me from asking too many questions about Mom's final days. His quick return to work, when most people would have taken more time to grieve. We reached the trees, just as flashlight beams began sweeping the area where we'd been crouching moments before. The woods behind our house, connected to a network of hiking trails that eventually led to the main road, but navigating them in the dark would be treacherous. One wrong step could send us tumbling down a ravine, or into one of the old quarry pits that dotted the area. This way, I whispered, taking the lead. I'd played in these woods as a child, knew every major trail and most of the shortcuts. If we could reach the old logging road about half a mile through the trees, we could follow it back to civilization without being seen from the house. Behind us, the search was intensifying. Multiple voices called out coordinates and search patterns. These weren't just hired thugs looking for a quick resolution. They were organized, professional, probably military or law enforcement trained. The kind of people who wouldn't give up easily, and who had the resources to turn a simple search into a manhunt. How many people do you think Robert has killed? I asked as we picked our way through the underbrush. Based on what we found, at least 15, maybe more. This has been going on for years, Sarah. A systematic operation that's generated millions of dollars in insurance fraud. Maria paused to check her phone, frowning at the lack of signal. But more importantly, how many people is he planning to kill to cover this up? The answer to that question became clear, as we heard gunshots from the direction of the house. Not random shots, but the deliberate sound of someone eliminating evidence or sending a message. My childhood home was being turned into a crime scene, and we were the primary targets. The logging road is just ahead, I said, pointing toward a gap in the trees that marked the old trail. From there we can reach Highway 23 in about 20 minutes. But as we approached the road, we saw headlights moving slowly along it, searching. Robert's people had anticipated our escape route, and were already moving to cut us off. We were trapped between the search party at the house, and vehicles patrolling the only road out of the area. There's an old hunting cabin about a mile north of here, I said, remembering weekend trips with Dad when I was younger. Back when I believed he was just a construction worker who liked to hunt deer, and teach his daughter about wildlife. It's been abandoned for years, but it's shelter, and there might be an old radio or phone line. Can you find it in the dark? I think so. Dad used to take Tommy and me there when we were kids. He said it belonged to a friend of his, but looking back, I wonder if it was part of Robert's operation. A place to meet or store equipment away from town. The irony of fleeing to a location that might be connected to the very conspiracy we were trying to expose wasn't lost on me. But with limited options and the sounds of pursuit getting closer, we didn't have the luxury of being choosy about our destinations. As we changed direction and headed deeper into the woods, I couldn't help thinking about the transformation my life had undergone in just a few hours. This morning I'd been a grieving daughter cleaning out her mother's belongings, trying to cope with loss and help her father through his darkest period. Now I was a fugitive running through the woods with evidence that could expose a multi-million-dollar murder conspiracy and send multiple people to prison. The worst part wasn't the physical danger, though that was real enough. It was the knowledge that everything I'd believed about my family was built on lies. My father wasn't a victim of circumstances or a man manipulated into participating in something beyond his control. According to Robert Hayes, he was a willing partner in murder, including the murder of his own wife. Sarah, Maria said quietly as we navigated a particularly difficult section of trail. Whatever we discover about your father's involvement, remember that it doesn't change who you are. You're not responsible for his choices. But I lived with him for 28 years. How could I not see what he was capable of? Because he didn't want you to see it. People like that are skilled at compartmentalizing, at maintaining different versions of themselves for different situations. The father who taught you to ride a bike, and the man who helped plan insurance murders, can exist in the same person without contradiction. The hunting cabin appeared through the trees like a ghost from my childhood, looking smaller and more run-down than I remembered. The roof was partially collapsed, and vines had grown up the sides of the building, but the basic structure was intact. More importantly, it was hidden from the main trails, and far enough from the road, that we might not be found until daylight. Inside the cabin was a time capsule of decay. Old furniture covered in dust and mouse droppings, hunting magazines from the 1990s, scattered across a wooden table, a stone fireplace that hadn't been used in years. But in one corner, covered by a tarp, was something that made my heart race. A shortwave radio, old but functional, connected to a car battery that still showed some charge. "Can you make that work?" Maria asked. "Maybe." Dad taught me basic radio operation when I was 12. Said every outdoorsman should know how to call for help if they got lost. Another memory that now carried sinister implications. Had he been teaching me practical skills, or preparing me for situations exactly like this one? The radio crackled to life after a few minutes of adjustment, and I managed to reach what sounded like a state police dispatcher in the next county. Maria took the microphone and identified herself, requesting immediate backup, and providing our approximate location. But as she finished the transmission, we heard the sound that made our blood run cold. Dogs barking in the distance, getting closer. Robert Hayes had brought tracking dogs, which meant our trail through the woods would lead them directly to us. The radio call for help might bring rescue, but it would also pinpoint our location for anyone else monitoring emergency frequencies. "We can't stay here," Maria said, already moving toward the back of the cabin. "How well do you know this area?" "There are some old quarry pits about 2 miles from here, filled with water, surrounded by steep rock faces. If we can reach them, the water might throw off the dog's scent. And if we can't?" I looked at the envelope of evidence still clutched in my hands, thinking about my mother's months of investigation, and the people whose deaths she'd been trying to solve. "Then we make sure this evidence gets to the right people, even if we don't survive to see justice done." As we prepared to leave the cabin and head deeper into the wilderness, I realized that my quiet life as a marketing professional in Columbus was over forever. Whether we escaped or were caught, whether my father was innocent or guilty, whether the conspiracy was exposed or covered up, I could never go back to believing in the simple narrative of a loving family touched by tragedy. The hunt for the truth had turned me into the hunted, and the only way forward was through the darkness that had swallowed my childhood whole. The quarry pits were a 20-minute trek through terrain that seemed designed to twist ankles and shred clothing. Every root and rock formation felt like an obstacle course in the darkness, but the sound of barking dogs behind us provided all the motivation we needed to keep moving. Maria had given me her backup flashlight, but we could only risk using them when absolutely necessary to avoid drawing attention to our location. The first pit we reached was smaller than I remembered, maybe 50 feet across, and filled with black water that reflected the stars like a mirror. The drop was steep but not impossible, with a narrow ledge that ran along one side about 10 feet down from the rim. If we could reach that ledge, we'd be hidden from view, and the water might confuse the tracking dog's scent trail. "I'll go first," Maria said, already testing handholds in the rocky face. "If something goes wrong, don't try to rescue me. Get that evidence to the state police, and let them handle everything else." "Nothing's going wrong," I said with more confidence than I felt. "We've come this far." The climb down was treacherous in the dark, but manageable for someone who'd spent childhood summers scrambling around these rock formations. The ledge was wider than it had looked from above, providing enough space for both of us to sit and rest while we waited to see if our pursuers would pick up our trail. We didn't have to wait long. Within 10 minutes, flashlight beams appeared at the edge of the woods, followed by the shapes of at least 4 men and 2 German shepherds. The dogs seemed confused when they reached the quarry, circling the rim and whining as they lost their scent at the water's edge. They went into the water, one of the men said, his voice carrying clearly across the still air. "Radio base and tell them to check all the quarry pits in the area. They can't have gone far." "What about the cabin?" Jenkins said he heard radio traffic from that direction. "State police are already en route to that location. We need to wrap this up before they arrive and start asking questions." From our hiding place on the ledge, I could see the men clearly in the glow of their flashlights. Professional security types, just as Maria had suspected. But their equipment and coordination suggested They were more than just hired muscle. These were people with serious training and resources. The kind of operation that could make people disappear permanently if necessary. One of them was speaking into a radio, coordinating with other search teams scattered throughout the area. From what I could hear, they had a dozen people involved in the mission, plus vehicles blocking the main roads out of the county. This wasn't just about silencing 2 witnesses. This was about containing a threat to what must be a massive criminal enterprise. "How long do you think we can stay here?" I whispered to Maria. "Until dawn, maybe. After that, they'll bring in helicopters with thermal imaging, and we'll be sitting ducks on this ledge." The radio chatter from above continued as the search teams regrouped and planned their next moves. What we heard made it clear that Robert Hayes' operation was far larger than even Mom's investigation had revealed. References to operations in 3 different states, dozens of active policies, and contingency plans for exposure suggested a network that had been operating for years, with sophisticated planning and multiple levels of protection. "Base, this is Team 3. We've got a problem at the Mitchell house. Local fire department is responding to a structure fire. Looks like someone torched the place to destroy evidence." My heart sank as I realized they were talking about our family home, the house where I'd grown up, where Mom had hidden her research, where 30 years of memories were stored in photo albums and keepsakes. All of it was going up in flames to cover the tracks of people who saw human life as nothing more than a profit opportunity. "Team leader, be advised that we have state police units approaching from the east. ETA, approximately 15 minutes. Recommend immediate extraction if targets are not located. Negative. We finish this tonight. Too much exposure risk if they reach authorities with that evidence." Marie squeezed my arm, pointing toward movement on the far side of the quarry. More flashlights were approaching, and it looked like they were preparing to search the water systematically. Our hiding place was good, but it wasn't perfect. If they brought boats or diving equipment, they'd find us eventually. "There's a drainage tunnel that connects this quarry to the next one," I whispered, remembering exploration adventures from my teenage years. "It's underwater but not very long. Maybe 30 feet. If we can hold our breath long enough, we can get to the other pit without being seen." That's assuming the tunnel isn't blocked after all those years, and assuming we don't drown in the attempt. The alternative is waiting here until they find us. Marie considered this for a moment, then began removing her jacket and boots. "How deep is the tunnel entrance?" "About 8 feet down from the surface. There should be a metal grate, but Dad and his friends used to remove it for maintenance access. If it's still off, we can swim through." The water was shockingly cold when we slipped into it. Cold enough to make breathing difficult, and thinking sluggish, but adrenaline and desperation provided the motivation to dive down into the black depths, feeling along the rocky wall for the tunnel entrance. My lungs were burning by the time I found the opening, and I had to surface once for air before attempting the swim through. The tunnel was longer than I remembered, filled with silt and debris that made navigation by touch nearly impossible. Halfway through, my
chest began to burn with the need for oxygen, and panic started to set in. But Maria's hand on my ankle provided reassurance, and the faint glow of starlight ahead marked the exit to the second quarry. We surfaced gasping and shivering in water that seemed even colder than the first pit. But we were alive, and more importantly, we were now several hundred yards away from the search teams with no direct line of sight to our original location. "The road is just beyond those trees," I said, pointing toward the eastern edge of the quarry. "If we can reach it without being seen, we can flag down help when the state police arrive." But as we climbed out of the water and began working our way up the rocky slope, we heard the sound that shattered our hopes of easy rescue. Helicopters approaching from the south, their searchlights sweeping the forest in systematic patterns. The manhunt was escalating to a level that suggested Robert Hayes had resources and connections we hadn't anticipated. "Corporate security doesn't have access to helicopters," Maria said grimly. "This is either government involvement or organized crime with serious backing." What does that mean for us? It means we're not just fighting a local insurance fraud scheme. We're up against something much bigger, and they have the resources to make us disappear permanently if they catch us. The helicopter searchlight swept over our position, forcing us to freeze against the rocks like deer caught in headlights. For a terrifying moment, the light lingered on our general area, and I was certain we'd been spotted. But then it moved on, continuing its methodical search pattern toward the first quarry, where our pursuers were still concentrated. We reached the tree line just as the sound of sirens became audible in the distance. State police, just as the radio chatter had indicated, but whether they were coming to rescue us or were part of the conspiracy remained to be seen.
In a small town where everyone knew everyone, and where a multi-million-dollar criminal operation had been functioning for years, it was impossible to know who could be trusted. "We need to be smart about this," Maria said, checking her service weapon and the evidence envelope we'd managed to keep dry during our underwater escape. "If Robert has people inside law enforcement, walking up to the first police car we see could be suicide, then what do we do?" "We call my contact at the FBI field office in Cleveland. Someone who's completely outside the local power structure and has the resources to investigate this properly." Using Maria's cell phone, which had miraculously survived our swim in a waterproof case, we reached Special Agent Jennifer Walsh at her home number. Maria's explanation was brief but compelling, and within minutes we had arrangements for a secure pickup at a truck stop on Interstate 80, about 5 miles from our current location. "Agent Walsh will have a full team there within an hour," Maria said. "All we have to do is reach the interstate without being caught." The trek to the truck stop took us through residential neighborhoods where every porch light and barking dog felt like a potential threat. But it also took us past familiar landmarks from my childhood, reminders of a time when Riverside had seemed like the safest place in the world. The high school where I'd graduated valedictorian. The park where Dad had taught me to throw a curveball. The church where we'd attended services every Sunday morning for 18 years. All of it looked different now, viewed through the lens of what I'd learned about the man who'd helped shape my understanding of right and wrong. How many of the business relationships he'd cultivated over the years were connected to Robert's operation? How many of the community leaders and local officials knew about the insurance murders and chose to look the other way? The truck stop was a beacon of normalcy when we finally reached it, filled with travelers and long-haul drivers who had no connection to the nightmare we'd been living. Agent Walsh was waiting in the parking lot with 2 other federal agents and a mobile command unit that looked like it could handle a small war. "Detective Santos," she said as we approached. "I hope you have something significant, because mobilizing a federal response team on a few hours' notice requires considerable justification." Maria handed over the evidence envelope and gave a rapid briefing on everything we'd discovered. Agent Walsh's expression grew more serious as she reviewed the insurance documents and audio transcripts, and by the time she reached the medical records showing how my mother had really died, she was already making phone calls to coordinate a major investigation. "This is definitely federal jurisdiction," she said. "Wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit murder across state lines, and possibly RICO violations if this network is as extensive as your evidence suggests. We'll need full statements from both of you, but first we need to secure the scene and make arrests before anyone else disappears." "What about my father?" I asked. "The evidence suggests he was involved, but I still don't know if he was willing participant or another victim. We'll find out. But Sarah, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that the man who raised you was capable of things you never imagined. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who betray us most completely." The federal investigation that followed made national news for weeks. Robert Hayes was arrested at his home along with 6 associates, including 2 hospital employees who had been facilitating the murders and 3 local officials who had been paid to overlook suspicious deaths and expedite insurance claims. The network had been operating in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, with at least 30 confirmed victims over an 8-year period. My father was found dead in his truck on a remote mountain road, apparently having crashed while attempting to flee the area. The official ruling was suicide, based on a note he'd left admitting his involvement in the scheme and expressing remorse for Linda's death. But the note also revealed that he'd been blackmailed into participation after Robert discovered financial irregularities in the construction company books. According to Dad's final confession, he'd never intended for anyone to die. Robert had presented the insurance policies as a simple fraud scheme, claiming they would only collect on people who died naturally. It wasn't until the murders began that Dad realized what he'd become part of, but by then Robert had enough evidence of his involvement to destroy him if he tried to withdraw. Mom's death had been the breaking point. Robert had insisted it was necessary to silence her investigation, and Dad had been forced to provide access to her hospital room. But he hadn't known Robert planned to kill her that night, and learning the truth had driven him to desperation and ultimately suicide. Whether that version of events was true or just a convenient story designed to preserve some remnant of my father's reputation, I'll never know for certain. What I do know is that the investigation vindicated my mother's work and brought justice for at least 30 families who had lost loved ones to Robert's greed. The insurance companies involved paid out millions in settlements, and the federal prosecutors used the RICO statutes to seize assets worth nearly $10 million. Robert Hayes received life in prison without possibility of parole, and his associates received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. As for me, I never returned to Riverside, except to testify at the trials. My childhood home was a total loss from the fire, but the insurance money allowed me to start over in a new city with a new identity. I changed my name, moved to Seattle, and found work with a nonprofit organization that assists families affected by violent crime. Sometimes I think about the version of my life that would have existed if I'd never climbed into that attic, if I'd never found Mom's research, if I'd simply accepted her death as a tragic consequence of cancer. It would have been easier to live with the lies than to discover the truth, easier to remember my parents as the loving couple who raised me rather than as victims and perpetrators of a conspiracy that destroyed dozens of lives. But then I remember the other potential victims on Mom's list, the people who are alive today because her investigation ultimately exposed Robert's operation. I remember the families who finally got answers about suspicious deaths that had haunted them for years. I remember that sometimes the hardest truths are the most important ones to uncover. My mother spent the final months of her life trying to save people she'd never met, risking everything to expose a conspiracy that most people would have ignored or dismissed. She died trying to protect the man who had betrayed her, and she left behind evidence that would ultimately bring justice to dozens of victims. In the end, Linda Mitchell's hit list wasn't a plan for murder. It was a plan for justice, hidden in an attic until her daughter was strong enough to carry it forward. And while the truth destroyed everything I thought I knew about my family, it also revealed the kind of woman my mother really was. The kind of woman worth running for, worth fighting for, and worth honoring by making sure her story was finally told. 6 months after Robert Hayes was sentenced to life in prison, I received a package with no return address at my new apartment in Seattle. Inside was a safety deposit box key, and a handwritten note that simply said, "Your mother wanted you to have this." I recognized Carol Jensen's careful script immediately, though I hadn't spoken to her since the trials ended. The safety deposit box was located at a bank in Columbus, about an hour from where I'd grown up. The drive back to Ohio felt like traveling through a nightmare I'd tried desperately to forget, but curiosity won over my reluctance to revisit that chapter of my life. The bank manager, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, explained that the box had been rented under my mother's maiden name 3 years before her death, with specific instructions that I should be contacted if anything happened to her. What I found inside changed everything I thought I understood about my mother's final investigation. The first item was a thick journal, bound in leather and filled with my mother's meticulous handwriting. The entries spanned almost 4 years, beginning with her first suspicions about the unusual number of accidental deaths in Riverside, and documenting her gradual discovery of the insurance fraud scheme. But these weren't just research notes. They were the thoughts and fears of a woman who realized she was uncovering something that could destroy her family. March 15th. David came home late again tonight, said he was working on the Henderson project, but I drove by the site around 7 and his truck wasn't there. Called Robert's house and his wife said he was out too, starting to wonder if they're meeting somewhere else, discussing things they don't want me to know about. April 2nd. Found insurance papers in David's truck while looking for his registration policy on Janet Morrison, the woman who died in that car accident last month. Why would David have her insurance information? She never worked for the construction company. April 20th. Confronted David about the Morrison policy. He said Robert handles all the employee insurance, that it was probably just paperwork that got mixed up. But Janet Morrison was never an employee. I checked May 8th. David knows I'm investigating. Caught him going through my desk last night. When I asked what he was looking for, he said he was worried about me. That I've been acting paranoid. Maybe I am paranoid. Maybe I want to be wrong about this. The entries painted a picture of a marriage slowly disintegrating under the weight of terrible suspicions. My mother had loved my father deeply, but she'd also been intelligent enough to recognize the evidence pointing to his involvement in something monstrous. The journal revealed months of internal struggle as she tried to reconcile the man she'd married with the possibility that he was participating in murder. June 12th. Can't sleep anymore. David watches me constantly now, monitors my phone calls, asks where I'm going every time I leave the house. He knows that I know, but we're both pretending everything is normal. Living with someone you suspect of murder, while trying to gather evidence against them, might be the loneliest thing in the world. July 4th. Tommy and Sarah were here for the holiday. Watching David with them, seeing how gentle and loving he is with our children, makes this even harder. How can someone be a devoted father and grandfather, while also being capable of taking other people's parents away from their children? August 18th. Found the real policy documents. David isn't just cooperating with Robert's scheme, he's been helping plan it from the beginning. His construction expertise is essential for creating the accidents that don't look suspicious. I married a killer, and I've been living with him for 30 years without knowing it. But it was the final entries, written just weeks before her death, that revealed the true scope of my mother's courage and the impossible position she'd found herself in. September 30th. The cancer is spreading faster than the doctors expected. They're saying months instead of years now. David has been so caring, so attentive, helping me with everything. Part of me wants to believe his concern is genuine, that maybe he really does love me despite everything else he's done. But I can't ignore what I know. October 10th. Told David I want to make a trip to see Sarah in Columbus before I get too sick to travel. He immediately volunteered to drive me, said he doesn't want me making the trip alone. I think he's afraid I'll tell her something. He's probably right to be afraid. October 25th. Robert visited today while David was at work. He knows about my investigation. He didn't threaten me directly, but he made it clear that my health problems could become more serious very quickly if I don't stop asking questions. He also mentioned Sarah and Tommy specifically, said it would be tragic if anything happened to them while they were dealing with their mother's illness. November 8th. David found my research files. I came home from chemo treatment to find him in the basement, going through the box where I'd hidden everything. He was crying when he saw me, actually crying. He said he never wanted me to find out, that he'd been trying to get out of the arrangement with Robert for years, but couldn't figure out how to do it without destroying our family. November 15th. David told me the truth about everything tonight. The insurance policies, the murders, his role in making the accidents look authentic. He said it started as simple fraud, just collecting on policies for people who were already dying, but Robert kept escalating until it became systematic murder. David claims he never killed anyone personally, just provided the technical expertise for creating structural failures and equipment malfunctions. November 22nd. Don't know whether to believe David's version of events or not. He seems genuinely remorseful, says he's been planning to turn himself in, but was afraid of what would happen to me and the kids. Now that I'm dying anyway, he thinks maybe this is his chance to finally do the right thing. But Robert will never let him walk away from this alive. December 1st. Made my decision. If David won't expose Robert's operation, I will. But I need to be smart about it. Need to make sure the evidence survives even if I don't. David still doesn't know about this safety deposit box or the copies of everything I've gathered. If something happens to me, Sarah will find the truth eventually. December 8th. David came to the hospital tonight, after visiting ours, said he needed to talk to me privately. He looked terrified, said Robert had given him an ultimatum. Either David convinces me to stop investigating, or Robert will make sure my death looks like a natural progression of the cancer. David begged me to just let it go, said we could spend whatever time I have left pretending everything is normal. December 12th. This is probably my last entry. David's agreed to help Robert silence me in exchange for a promise that Sarah and Tommy will be left alone. I don't think he really believes Robert will honor that promise, but he's desperate and scared, and probably telling himself that my death from cancer is inevitable anyway. I forgive him. I understand why he made the choices he did, even if I can't accept them. December 15th. Hidden copies of everything in 3 different locations. If you're reading this, Sarah, it means I didn't survive to see justice done. Your father isn't the monster Robert Hayes is, but he's not innocent either. He chose to protect himself and his business, instead of protecting the people Robert murdered. I hope you can find a way to forgive him eventually, but more importantly, I hope you can find a way to forgive yourself for whatever you discover about our family. I sat in that sterile bank cubicle, crying over my mother's journal, while strangers conducted their business around me, completely unaware that I was reading the final thoughts of a woman who'd been murdered by her own husband. The entries revealed a level of betrayal that made the federal investigation's findings seem almost merciful in comparison. The second item in the safety deposit box was even more devastating. A USB drive containing audio recordings my mother had made secretly during her final weeks. Conversations with my father, where he admitted his role in the murders, pleaded with her to stop investigating, and ultimately agreed to help Robert kill her in exchange for promises about Tommy and my safety. Listening to those recordings was like experiencing my parents' marriage dissolve in real time. I could hear the love in my mother's voice even as she documented evidence that would send my father to prison. I could hear my father's genuine anguish as he chose self-preservation over justice, convenience over courage. But it was the final recording that broke my heart completely. A conversation between my parents on what must have been my mother's last night alive, where she forgave him for what he was about to do, and made him promise to be a good father to Tommy and me, after she was gone. I need you to understand something, David. What you're doing to me doesn't change the fact that I love you. It doesn't change the 30 years we had together, or the children we raised, or the life we built. You're making a terrible choice, but you're making it out of fear, not malice. Linda, please, we can still figure out another way to handle this. Robert doesn't have to know you stopped investigating. Robert already knows everything, David. He's been watching me for months, monitoring my communications, tracking my movements. The only reason I'm still alive is because he wanted to see if you'd be willing to do this yourself. It's a test of your loyalty to him. I can't do this. I can't be the one who you won't be. Robert will handle the actual process. All you have to do is make sure he has access to my room tomorrow night, and that you're not here when it happens. Then you grieve like any loving husband would, and you move on with your life. How can you be so calm about this? Because I made my choice weeks ago, and now you're making yours. I chose to seek justice for the people Robert murdered, even knowing it would probably cost me my life. You're choosing to prioritize your own survival and our children's future over holding a killer accountable. Neither choice is simple or easy, but they're the choices we made. I love you, Linda. I know that doesn't matter now, but I need you to know that everything I did was because I love you and the kids more than anything. I know you do, and I need you to know that I forgive you. Not because what you're doing is right, but because love doesn't always make us brave enough to do what's right. Sometimes it makes us weak enough to do what's necessary. The recording ended there, but there was one more item in the safety deposit box. A letter addressed to me specifically, and dated the day before my mother's death. My dearest Sarah, it began. If you're reading this, it means the cancer didn't kill me after all, and you've discovered the truth about how I really died. I hope this knowledge doesn't destroy your faith in love or family, or the possibility that people can choose to do good even when they've done terrible things. Your father is not a good man, but he's not completely evil either. He's weak, and he's scared, and he made a series of choices that led him down a path he never intended to walk. The man who taught you to ride a bike and helped you with your homework really does exist. He's just also the man who chose his own safety over the lives of strangers, and ultimately over my life as well. I don't expect you to forgive him. I don't even expect you to understand how I can forgive him. But I hope you can find a way to separate the father who loved you from the man who participated in murder. You are not responsible for his crimes, just as you are not defined by his choices. What you are responsible for is deciding what to do with the truth you've discovered. I've given you evidence that could put dangerous people in prison and bring justice to families who deserve answers. But I've also given you information that could destroy what's left of your relationship with your father and change how you remember your entire childhood. The choice is yours, Sarah. You can take this evidence to the authorities and see justice done, knowing it will mean the end of everything you believed about our family. Or you can walk away, let sleeping dogs lie, and try to find peace with partial truths and comfortable lies. Whatever you decide, know that I'm proud of the woman you've become. You have a strength I never possessed, and a moral courage that will serve you well, whatever path you choose. You are the best thing your father and I ever created together, and nothing that's happened since can change that. All my love, Mom. I sat in that bank cubicle for 2 hours, processing everything I'd learned, and trying to decide what to do with information that could rewrite the ending of a story I thought I'd already finished. The federal investigation had focused on Robert Hayes and his network, treating my father as a victim who'd been blackmailed and ultimately murdered for trying to withdraw from the conspiracy. But the evidence in this safety deposit box told a different story. It revealed a man who'd been a willing participant in murder for years, who'd only shown remorse when his own wife became a target, and who'd ultimately chosen to help kill her rather than face the consequences of his actions. The question was whether exposing this truth would serve any purpose beyond satisfying my own need for complete honesty. Robert Hayes was already serving life in prison. The other conspirators had been caught and sentenced. The families of the victims had received some measure of justice and closure. Revealing my father's deeper involvement wouldn't bring back the dead, or significantly change the sentences already handed down. It would only destroy the carefully constructed narrative that allowed Tommy and me to maintain some positive memories of the man who'd raised us. but it would also mean that several families never got the complete truth about how their loved ones died. It would mean that some of Robert's victims were never properly acknowledged, their deaths attributed to accidents rather than murders. It would mean that the historical record of this case would be incomplete, sanitized to protect the reputation of a man who'd chosen profit over human life. I made my decision sitting in that bank cubicle, surrounded by the evidence of my mother's final investigation. I took the USB drive and the journal, but I left the letter. Some truths are too important to bury, even when revealing them causes pain. The supplementary evidence I provided to the FBI led to the reopening of several cases that had been closed as accidents. 3 more families received official acknowledgement that their loved ones had been murdered, along with compensation from the insurance companies involved. The historical record was corrected to reflect the true scope of Robert Hayes' operation and the number of people who died for his profit. But I never publicly revealed the recordings of my parents' final conversations, or the details of my father's willing participation in my mother's murder. Some truths are meant for official files and legal proceedings, not for public consumption or family destruction. Tommy and I still gather for holidays, though we don't talk much about our parents anymore. He knows there were aspects of Dad's involvement that never came out during the trials, but he's never asked for details, and I've never volunteered them. Some mercy lies in allowing people to carry the amount of truth they're strong enough to bear. I kept my mother's journal, though I only read it on the anniversary of her death. It serves as a reminder that courage doesn't always look heroic, that love sometimes requires us to act against our own interests, and that the people we admire most are often the ones who choose to do what's right, even when it costs them everything. My mother spent her final months knowing she was going to be murdered by the people she loved most, and she used that time to ensure their crimes wouldn't go unpunished. She forgave her killer while documenting his guilt, protected her children while seeking justice for strangers, and faced her own death with a grace I hope I never have to find in myself. Linda Mitchell's hit list wasn't a plan for revenge, or a cry for help, or a desperate attempt to save herself. It was a roadmap to justice, carefully prepared by a woman who knew she wouldn't live to see it implemented. She hid the truth in places her family would eventually find it, trusting that love and justice could coexist, even in the darkest circumstances. The list had my father's name at the top, not because she wanted him dead, because she understood he was already dying, killed by fear and weakness, and a series of choices that had turned him into someone she couldn't save. The word first, written in red ink, wasn't a threat or a priority ranking. It was an acknowledgement that she was losing him first, before cancer could take her, before Robert could silence her, before their family could be destroyed by the truth she was determined to preserve. In the end, my mother's greatest act of love wasn't forgiving the man who helped murder her. It was ensuring that the evidence of his crimes would survive long enough for justice to be done, even if that justice came at the cost of everything she'd spent 30 years building. Some legacies are built on the things we create, others are built on the truths we refuse to let die with us. My mother chose the harder path, and I'm still learning to live up to the example she set in her final months. Not the example of a perfect victim, but the example of an imperfect person who chose to do what was right, even when it meant sacrificing everything she held dear. 2 years after discovering my mother's safety deposit box, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story of the Riverside insurance murders. The case had gained national attention as one of the most sophisticated fraud schemes in recent history, and several production companies were competing to secure the rights to our family's story. I turned them all down, except for one. Rebecca Martinez was different from the others.
She wasn't interested in sensationalizing the murders or turning my family's tragedy into entertainment. She was the daughter of one of Robert Hayes' victims, a man who died in what appeared to be a construction accident 3 years before my mother's investigation began. Rebecca had spent years fighting to get her father's case reopened, only to be told repeatedly that there wasn't enough evidence to support her suspicions. When the federal investigation finally vindicated her beliefs and revealed that her father had indeed been murdered, she decided to document the entire conspiracy to ensure that the victims would be remembered as more than just statistics in a criminal case. She wanted to understand how such an extensive operation could function for years in a small community where everyone supposedly knew everyone else. "The thing that bothers me most," she said during our first meeting at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, "isn't just that these people were murdered for money, it's that the community they trusted, the system they believed would protect them, was the very thing that killed them. How do you rebuild faith in humanity after discovering something like that?" It was a question I'd been wrestling with since the night I'd run through those dark woods with evidence that would destroy everything I thought I knew about love and family. How do you continue believing in the goodness of people when the people closest to you were capable of such calculated evil? How do you trust your own judgment about character when you'd lived with a killer for decades without recognizing what he was? Rebecca's documentary project became something more than just a film about criminal conspiracy. It became an exploration of how communities hide their secrets, how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil, and how survivors find ways to rebuild their lives after fundamental betrayals. She interviewed dozens of people connected to the case, from the families of victims to law enforcement officials to former employees of Mitchell and Hayes Construction. What emerged was a picture of a small town that had been slowly corrupted over time, where warning signs had been ignored or explained away, where people had chosen comfortable denial over uncomfortable truth. The documentary revealed that several residents had suspected something was wrong with the unusually high number of accidental deaths, but they'd convinced themselves that small towns were just dangerous places where people worked risky jobs and lived too close to highways and industrial sites. One of the most powerful interviews was with Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the emergency room physician who had treated many of Robert's victims in their final moments. She admitted that she'd noticed patterns in the injuries and symptoms she was seeing, but she'd dismissed her suspicions as paranoid thinking brought on by working too many trauma cases. You want to believe that when people come to you dying or injured, it's because of genuine accidents or natural causes, she said. The alternative is accepting that someone in your community is deliberately creating these tragedies, and that's such a horrifying possibility that your mind rejects it automatically. It's easier to believe in bad luck than to believe in human evil. Another interview that stayed with me was with Janet Morrison's daughter, the woman whose insurance policy I'd found among my mother's research. Janet had been killed in what appeared to be a single-car accident on a rural highway, her vehicle reportedly sliding off the road during an ice storm. But the investigation revealed that her brakes had been tampered with, and the timing of her death corresponded exactly to Robert's need for cash to cover some failed investments. My mother was the most careful driver I knew, her daughter Sarah said. She grew up driving in Ohio winters, and she would never have been going fast enough on icy roads to lose control like that. But when I tried to get the police to investigate more thoroughly, they said I was just looking for someone to blame because I couldn't accept that it was an accident. They made me feel like I was crazy for thinking someone would want to hurt her. The documentary also explored the psychological profiles of the conspirators, trying to understand how ordinary people could transition into systematic murder. A forensic psychologist explained that insurance fraud often escalates gradually, with participants crossing increasingly serious moral boundaries until murder becomes just another business decision. Robert Hayes didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a serial killer, the expert explained. He probably started with simple fraud, maybe inflating claims or staging minor accidents for financial gain. Each successful crime made the next one easier to justify, and each new participant became more invested in protecting the operation. By the time they were committing murder, they'd already convinced themselves that they were just smart business people taking advantage of a flawed system. But it was the interview with Robert Hayes himself that provided the most chilling insights into the conspiracy. Rebecca had somehow convinced him to speak with her from prison, though his motives for agreeing to the interview remained unclear. Perhaps he wanted to control the narrative about his crimes, or perhaps he simply enjoyed the attention after years of operating in secret. People act like what we did was some kind of unprecedented evil, he said, speaking with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. But insurance fraud happens every day in this country, we just happen to be more efficient about it than most people. And the deaths were clean, quick, designed to minimize suffering. It's not like we were torturing people or killing them in ways that caused unnecessary pain. When Rebecca asked him about the impact on the victims' families, his response revealed a complete absence of empathy that was somehow more disturbing than open malice would have been. Everyone dies eventually, he said. We just accelerated the timeline for some people who were living unproductive lives anyway. Most of our targets were older, sick, or struggling financially. In some ways, we did them a favor by ending their suffering and providing their families with insurance money they wouldn't have had otherwise. The most difficult part of participating in the documentary was discussing my father's role in the conspiracy. Rebecca wanted to understand the psychology of someone who could be both a loving parent and a willing participant in murder, and she pressed me for details about his relationship with our family versus his relationship with Robert's operation. Did you ever see signs of the person he was capable of being? She asked. Were there moments when his mask slipped, when you caught glimpses of someone who could help plan murders?
I thought about that question for weeks before answering, reviewing decades of memories and trying to separate genuine recollections from knowledge that had been colored by subsequent revelations. The truth was that there had been signs, moments when my father's behavior didn't match the image of the man I thought he was. I remembered times when he'd been unusually nervous before certain construction projects, making phone calls in hushed tones and disappearing for meetings he couldn't explain. I remembered his strange reactions to news reports about local accidents, how he'd change the channel quickly or leave the room when certain cases were discussed. I remembered how he'd discouraged my mother from volunteering with local emergency services, claiming he didn't want her exposed to traumatic situations. Most tellingly, I remembered how he'd reacted when I'd chosen to study criminal justice in college, expressing an unusual level of concern about my career choice, and suggesting that some crimes were better left unsolved, because the truth could destroy innocent people's lives. Looking back, I think he was trying to prepare me for the possibility that I might discover something terrible about our family. I told Rebecca, not because he wanted to confess, but because he was afraid of what would happen if his secrets were exposed. He loved us, but he also feared us, because we represented the normal life he was pretending to live while participating in something monstrous. The documentary also examined the broader social implications of the conspiracy, interviewing sociologists and criminologists about how communities can become complicit in protecting predators. One expert explained that small towns often develop informal networks of protection around successful or influential residents, making it easier for criminals to operate with impunity if they're careful about maintaining their public image. Robert Hayes was a pillar of the community, the expert noted. He donated to local charities, sponsored Little League teams, served on the town council. When people have that kind of public profile, it becomes very difficult for others to believe they could be capable of serious crimes. The cognitive dissonance is too great, so people dismiss evidence or rationalize suspicious behavior rather than accepting that they've been deceived. The documentary crew also interviewed Tommy, though he was reluctant to participate and insisted on certain restrictions about what could be discussed. He'd struggled more than I had with the revelations about our father, partly because he'd been closer to Dad, and partly because he'd chosen to remain in Ohio rather than starting over somewhere new. The hardest part isn't accepting that Dad was capable of murder, he said. It's accepting that I missed all the signs, that I lived in the same house as someone who was planning these crimes and never suspected anything was wrong. It makes you question your ability to judge people, to trust your own instincts about who's safe and who's dangerous. Tommy had also struggled with the community's reaction to our family's involvement in the case. While most people expressed sympathy for what we'd endured, there were others who seemed to blame us for bringing unwanted attention to Riverside. Some residents felt that the documentary and ongoing media coverage were unfairly damaging the town's reputation, as if the real problem was the exposure of the crimes rather than the crimes themselves. There are people who think we should have kept quiet about what we discovered, Tommy said. They believe that exposing Dad's involvement only hurt our family without bringing back any of the victims or preventing future crimes. They think we chose revenge over healing, and they resent us for making Riverside infamous instead of letting everyone move on quietly. That attitude reflected one of the most troubling aspects of the entire case, the number of people who seemed more concerned with protecting their community's image than with seeking justice for the victims. Even after the conspiracy was exposed and the perpetrators were imprisoned, there remained a significant faction of residents who wished the truth had never come to light. Rebecca's documentary ultimately ran for 3 hours and was divided into 6 episodes that aired on a major streaming platform. The response was overwhelming, generating national conversations about insurance fraud, small-town corruption, and the psychology of murder conspiracies. But for me, the most meaningful response came from the families of victims who finally felt that their loved ones' stories had been told with dignity and respect. Maria Santos, the detective who had helped me escape that night in the woods, was promoted to chief of police in a neighboring county, partly based on her work exposing the conspiracy. She continued to investigate similar cases and became a national expert on insurance fraud schemes. We stayed in touch over the years, and she often credited our collaboration as the most important case of her career. What your mother did, she told me during one of our conversations, was provide a master class in how to investigate complex criminal conspiracies. She understood that the key wasn't just gathering evidence, but creating multiple backup systems to ensure the evidence would survive even if she didn't. Most people would have confronted the suspects directly, or tried to handle everything through official channels. She was smart enough to know that neither approach would work against people with resources and connections. The documentary's success led to other opportunities, including speaking engagements at law enforcement conferences and victim advocacy organizations. I found myself becoming an unexpected expert on the intersection of family betrayal and criminal conspiracy, helping other people navigate the complex emotions that arise when someone you love turns out to be someone you never really knew. One of the most frequent questions I received was whether I regretted exposing the truth about my father's involvement. People wanted to know if I wished I'd never found my mother's research, if ignorance might have been preferable to the knowledge that destroyed my ability to remember my childhood without pain. The answer was complicated. There were certainly times when I envied people who could maintain simple, positive memories of their families without the complication of moral ambiguity and criminal behavior. There were nights when I wished I could go back to believing that my father was just a construction worker who loved his family and worked hard to provide for them. But ultimately I came to understand that the truth, however painful, was preferable to living a lie. My mother had died protecting that truth, and honoring her sacrifice meant ensuring that it survived and served its intended purpose. The families of Robert's victims deserved justice, and future potential victims deserved protection, even if providing those things came at the cost of my own peace of mind. More importantly, I learned that love doesn't require ignorance to survive. I could still cherish the moments when my father had been genuinely caring and supportive while acknowledging that he was also capable of terrible things. People are complex, and accepting that complexity meant accepting that someone could be both a loving parent and a willing participant in murder without those two aspects of their personality necessarily contradicting each other. The final episode of Rebecca's documentary ended with a question that I continued to grapple with years later: what responsibility do we have to expose uncomfortable truths, when doing so will cause pain to innocent people? My mother had chosen to pursue justice, even though she knew it would destroy her family's peace. I had chosen to continue her work even though it meant living with knowledge that made normal relationships difficult. Neither of us had made those choices lightly, and neither of us had been entirely sure we were doing the right thing. But we had both ultimately decided that some truths are too important to bury, that justice for the dead and protection for the living outweigh the comfort of convenient lies. My mother's hit list had never been about revenge, or hatred, or even justice in the traditional sense. It had been about creating a record that would survive her death, and eventually lead to accountability for people who thought they were above the law. She had used her final months to ensure that Robert Hayes' victims would be remembered, and that his operation would be exposed, even though she knew the cost would be her own life and her family's destruction. In the end, that list represented the most selfless act I could imagine: a dying woman choosing to protect strangers at the expense of everything she held dear. It was a testament to the belief that some things matter more than personal comfort, that some responsibilities transcend family loyalty, that some truths demand to be told regardless of the consequences. I kept a copy of that list in my desk drawer, not as a memento of the horrors it had revealed, but as a reminder of the courage it had taken to create it. Whenever I faced difficult decisions about truth versus comfort, justice versus peace, I would look at my mother's careful handwriting, and remember that sometimes the hardest choices are the most important ones to make. Linda Mitchell had saved her most important lesson for last, teaching me that real love sometimes requires us to act against our immediate interests, that true courage often looks like quiet determination rather than dramatic heroism, and that the people we lose can continue to guide us long after they're gone, if we're brave enough to follow the example they set. 5 years after the documentary aired, I received a letter that changed my understanding of my mother's investigation once again. The envelope was postmarked from a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania, and the return address showed a name I didn't recognize. Inside was a handwritten confession from someone who claimed to have been part of Robert Hayes' operation but had never been caught or prosecuted. Marcus Webb had been a paramedic in Riverside for 12 years, working closely with the hospital where my mother died, and several of the other victims had been treated. His letter detailed how he'd been recruited by Robert to help stage accidents and ensure that victims didn't survive their injuries, in exchange for substantial payments that had allowed him to support his disabled wife and pay for experimental treatments not covered by insurance. "I know this doesn't excuse what I did," he wrote, "but I want you to understand that some of us weren't motivated by greed. I was desperate to save my wife's life, and Robert offered me a way to get the money we needed. I told myself that the people we targeted were already living difficult lives, that we were ending their suffering while helping families who really needed the insurance money." Marcus explained that he'd been the one who actually administered the drug that killed my mother, entering her hospital room posing as a night shift worker while my father waited in the parking lot. He described how Robert had convinced my father that Linda's death was inevitable anyway, that they were simply controlling the timing to ensure it happened before she could expose their operation. Your father wasn't in the room when it happened, Marcus wrote. He couldn't bring himself to watch, so he left and drove around for hours while I did what needed to be done. When I came outside, he was sitting in his truck crying. He kept saying he was sorry, that he'd never wanted any of this to happen, that he just didn't know how to stop it. The letter included details about other murders that had never been officially connected to Robert's scheme, including several cases in neighboring counties where Marcus had been called in as backup emergency personnel. The scope of the conspiracy was even larger than the federal investigation had revealed, with tentacles reaching into multiple jurisdictions and involving dozens of people in various capacities. But the most shocking revelation in Marcus's letter was his explanation of why he decided to confess now, years after the case had been closed. He'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer, the same disease that had killed my mother, and facing his own mortality had forced him to confront the weight of what he'd done. I keep thinking about your mother's final moments, he wrote. She knew what was happening when I entered her room. She looked at me with these sad, understanding eyes, like she forgave me even though I was about to kill her. She didn't fight or scream or beg, she just whispered, "Tell Sarah I love her," and closed her eyes. I've been carrying those words for 5 years, and I can't die without passing them along. Marcus's confession led to a reopening of several cold cases and ultimately resulted in additional arrests and prosecutions. 3 more conspirators were identified and charged, including a funeral director who had been falsifying death certificates and an insurance claims adjuster who had been expediting payments. The web of corruption had been even more extensive than anyone had imagined. But for me, the most important part of Marcus's letter was the message from my mother. She had spent her final moments thinking about me, making sure I knew she loved me even as she faced death at the hands of people she'd trusted. It was the kind of grace under pressure that had defined her entire investigation, the ability to maintain love and forgiveness even in the face of ultimate betrayal. The letter also prompted me to reach out to Marcus directly, though visiting a federal prison required extensive background checks and approval processes. When I finally sat across from him in a sterile visiting room, I was struck by how ordinary he looked. Not a monster or a criminal mastermind, just a tired middle-aged man carrying the weight of terrible choices. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said when I asked why he'd decided to confess. "I just needed someone to know that your mother died with dignity. She wasn't a victim in that room, she was someone who understood what was happening and chose to face it with courage. I wanted you to know that her final act was one of love, not fear." Marcus died 6 months later, and I found myself attending his funeral at the request of his widow. She was a frail woman in a wheelchair, clearly suffering from the degenerative disease that had motivated her husband's participation in Robert's scheme. She thanked me for visiting Marcus in prison, saying it had given him some measure of peace in his final months. "He was a good man who did terrible things for love," she said. "I know that doesn't make it right, but I hope you can understand that he never stopped being horrified by what he'd become. Your forgiveness meant everything to him." The experience of confronting Marcus forced me to grapple with questions I'd been avoiding for years. How do you respond to genuine remorse from someone who participated in murdering your mother? How do you balance justice with mercy when the perpetrator is dying, and his confession helps solve other crimes? How do you honor the victim while acknowledging the humanity of the victimizer? These weren't abstract philosophical questions anymore. They were practical moral dilemmas that required real decisions about how to live and what values to prioritize. My mother had somehow found a way to forgive the people who were killing her, but I struggled to match that level of grace. The 10th anniversary of my mother's death fell on a rainy Tuesday in March, and I found myself back in Riverside for the first time since the trials had ended. The town looked different, smaller somehow, as if the weight of its secrets had diminished its physical presence. Many of the businesses that had been thriving when I was young had closed, and several of the families I'd grown up with had moved away. I visited the cemetery where my mother was buried, bringing flowers, and the latest letter I'd received from someone whose life had been affected by the case. This time it was from a young woman whose grandfather had been one of Robert's early victims, thanking me for ensuring that his death was recognized as murder rather than accident. She'd used the insurance settlement to attend college and become a nurse, dedicating her career to helping people in his memory. Standing at my mother's grave, I realized that the ripple effects of her investigation were still spreading, still touching lives, and inspiring people to choose courage over comfort. The hit list she'd compiled hadn't just exposed a criminal conspiracy, it had created a legacy of truth-telling that continued to influence people years after her death. That evening, I drove past the lot where our family home had stood before Robert's people burned it down. Someone had built a new house there, a modern structure that bore no resemblance to the colonial where I'd grown up. The new owners had no idea of the history of their property, the secrets that had been hidden in its attic, the evidence that had been discovered in its basement. Part of me envied their ignorance. They could live in that space without being haunted by memories of betrayal and murder, without wondering which conversations had been overheard, or which family gatherings had been shadowed by criminal planning. They could experience the house as just a home, nothing more complicated than shelter and comfort. But I'd learned that willful ignorance wasn't really an option once you'd seen the truth. My mother had taught me that some knowledge comes with responsibilities, that once you understand how much suffering can be hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life, you have an obligation to remain vigilant and speak up when necessary. The drive back to Seattle took me through the countryside where I'd once run for my life, past the quarry where Maria and I had hidden from tracking dogs, through the small towns where Robert's network had operated with impunity for years. The landscape looked peaceful in the evening light, giving no hint of the violence that had occurred there, or the fear that had once sent me fleeing through dark woods. I thought about all the lives that had been changed by what started as one woman's suspicions about a pattern of deaths. My mother's investigation had led to the exposure of a conspiracy that spanned multiple states and claimed dozens of victims. It had resulted in life sentences for the perpetrators, and millions of dollars in restitution for the families affected. It had changed laws about insurance fraud investigation, and inspired new protocols for detecting suspicious death patterns. But more than that, it had demonstrated the power of one person's refusal to accept convenient lies when uncomfortable truths demanded attention. Linda Mitchell had been an ordinary woman living an ordinary life, until she noticed something that others had missed or chosen to ignore. Her decision to investigate rather than dismiss those suspicions had ultimately saved lives, and brought justice to families who had given up hope of ever learning what really happened to their loved ones. As I reached the outskirts of Seattle, and began the final stretch of highway toward home, I understood that my mother's hit list would always be more than just evidence in a criminal case. It was a testament to the belief that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they choose to act on their moral convictions, even when doing so requires tremendous personal sacrifice. The names on that list represented more than just potential victims or investigative targets. They represented my mother's commitment to truth, her refusal to let injustice continue simply because exposing it was dangerous, and her faith that someone would eventually carry forward the work she'd started, even if she didn't survive to complete it herself. That someone had turned out to be me, though I'd never asked for the responsibility, and still sometimes resented the burden it represented. But I'd also learned that the most important legacies aren't the ones we choose to inherit. They're the ones that choose us, demanding that we rise to meet challenges we never expected to face, and find strength we didn't know we possessed. Linda Mitchell's final gift to her daughter wasn't the comfortable lie that our family was normal and safe. It was the difficult truth that normal families can harbor terrible secrets, that safety often requires vigilance, and that love sometimes demands that we risk everything we hold dear, in service of principles that matter more than personal comfort. It was a gift I was still learning to unwrap, still discovering new layers of meaning and responsibility years after her death. But it was also a gift I was grateful to have received, because it had taught me that the people we lose can continue to guide us long after they're gone, if we're brave enough to follow the example they set and wise enough to understand the lessons they left behind. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.